3 days after I buried my husband, I stood outside my own kitchen window and heard my children calmly discussing how they were going to take everything he had left me. My son's voice came first, steady and practical, the same tone he used when talking about business or investments. He said, "Mom isn't thinking clearly since Dad died. If we file now, the judge will understand." My daughter answered quietly, "We just need to move before she talks to the lawyer." Then my youngest let out a small laugh that made something deep inside my chest turn cold. "Relax," she said. "Mom will sign whatever we give her. She always does." For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood there in the cool October air, staring through the window of the house where I had raised them, listening as my own children calmly discussed my future as if I were already gone. And the strange thing is, I didn't cry. I didn't burst into the room or demand an explanation. I simply listened, because something in the quiet certainty of their voices made me realize that they believed I was weak now, fragile from grief, easy to control. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 72 years old, and 2 weeks ago, I buried the man who had stood beside me for 45 years. Harold and I built our life slowly, piece by piece, in a quiet town where people still greet each other on the sidewalks, and where the church bells echo through the streets on Sunday mornings. We raised 3 children in that house behind me. For most of my life, I believed family meant protection, that the people you raised would never look at you and see an opportunity. But grief has a way of revealing truths that comfort hides. The morning of Harold's funeral was cold and gray, the kind of autumn day where the sky hangs low and the air smells faintly of fallen leaves. The chapel near our home could hold nearly 200 people. Yet, when the service began, I counted only 17. I remember counting them more than once, because my hands needed something to do while my heart tried to stay steady. 17 people sat quietly in the wooden pews. 2 of Harold's former coworkers, our neighbor from across the street, a nurse from the hospital who had cared for him during his final week, and a few friends from the senior center where Harold liked to drink coffee every Tuesday morning. But my children weren't there. I had called each of them the morning Harold passed away, just after sunrise. My eldest son told me he had meetings he couldn't cancel. My daughter said she would try to come, but never called again. My youngest sent a short message saying work was too busy. So 17 people stood quietly while the organ played a hymn Harold never even liked. And I stood at the front of the chapel, speaking about the man who had spent his entire life loving his family. I told them how he whistled softly when he fixed things around the house, how he folded napkins into careful squares when he was thinking, how he believed kindness mattered more than pride. My voice trembled twice while I spoke, but I finished because Harold deserved to be remembered with dignity. After the service, his lawyer, Daniel Brooks, approached me outside the chapel and held my hand a little longer than necessary. "Margaret," he said gently, "there are a few things Harold wanted me to discuss with you when you're ready." At the time, I barely heard him because a part of me still expected my children to appear suddenly, apologizing for being late, explaining that something 2 days later I returned to the house Harold and I had shared for nearly 4 decades. The porch swing he built creaked softly in the wind as I stepped onto the front steps. The kitchen light was on, and voices drifted through the open window. For a moment, my heart lifted, thinking perhaps my children had come to comfort me after all. Then I heard my son say, "The doctor already said grief can affect judgment. If we file for temporary guardianship, the court will listen." My daughter answered calmly, "We just need Mom to stay here long enough." In that moment, everything inside me became very quiet. They weren't here to support me. They were here to control me. My hands trembled slightly as I stood outside the window, listening to them talk about bank accounts, property, and investments, as if the life Harold had spent decades building already belonged to them. Slowly, almost without thinking, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. A volunteer at the senior center had once shown me how to record audio on a smartphone, and I had never imagined I would use that knowledge standing outside my own kitchen window. I pressed the record button and watched the small red light appear while their voices continued inside. I didn't yet know what I would do with that recording. All I knew was that my husband had once warned me, very quietly, that if something ever happened to him, I should be careful about who I trusted. Standing there in the cold October air, listening to my own children planning my future without me, I finally understood why. And what my children didn't know was that Harold had prepared for this long before he. The next morning, I sat alone in my bedroom, listening to the recording through a small pair of headphones, and the sound of my children calmly discussing my life made the house feel strangely unfamiliar. Their voices were patient and practical, the way people speak when they believe they are solving a simple problem. To them, I was no longer their mother. I was an obstacle that needed to be managed. For most of my life, I had believed patience and kindness were enough to keep a family together. But Harold used to say something very different. Whenever I excused the children's behavior, he would shake his head gently and say, "Margaret, kindness doesn't mean letting people walk through your life with muddy boots." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Sitting there with that recording in my hands, I realized he had simply seen the truth before I did. Downstairs, my daughter was making coffee while my son spoke on the phone in the living room. Their voices sounded perfectly normal, as if the conversation I had heard the night before had never happened. They believed I knew nothing, and for the moment, that belief gave me an advantage. I walked into the kitchen slowly, letting my shoulders sag the way grief naturally makes them sag. My daughter pulled out a chair for me and placed a gentle hand on my arm. "You shouldn't be alone right now, Mom," she said softly. Maybe you should stay here for a while. My son nodded in agreement and added that it would be better if someone helped manage things until I felt stronger. Anyone watching would have believed they were carrying children, trying to protect their grieving mother. I thanked them quietly and said very little. Inside my chest, something had already begun to change. Later that afternoon, I drove to see Daniel Brooks. His office sat in a small brick building one town over, the kind of place where the air smells faintly of paper and coffee and old wooden desks. Daniel greeted me with a quiet nod and slid a folder across the desk. Harold asked me to give this to you, he said. Inside was a letter written in Harold's familiar handwriting, and my hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. In the letter, Harold explained something I had never known. 3 years earlier, he had quietly placed nearly everything we owned into a legal trust. The house, the savings, the investments, everything we had built together was protected there. No one could move that money or control those assets without 2 signatures, mine and Daniel's. Without both of us agreeing, nothing could be touched. For a long moment, I simply stared at the page, realizing that while I had been focusing on caring for Harold during his illness, he had been quietly protecting my future. Daniel opened another folder and turned it toward me. Inside were printed emails my eldest son had sent Harold over the past few years, asking for money again and again, sometimes politely, sometimes urgently. Harold had refused every request, and he had saved every message. As I read through them, a slow understanding settled over me. My husband hadn't just protected our finances. He had prepared for the possibility that the people closest to us might try to take advantage of my grief after he was gone. Daniel watched my expression carefully before speaking again. I don't know exactly what your children are planning, he said slowly, but Harold suspected they might try something. I thought about the recording on my phone, about the calm voices drifting through the kitchen window the night before. They're planning to declare me incapable, I said quietly. Daniel nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion he had already considered. Then it's fortunate Harold prepared for that possibility. When I left his office that afternoon, the world felt different, not easier, but clearer. My children believed they could manipulate a grieving widow into surrendering everything she owned. What they didn't realize was that the recording on my phone was only the beginning of the evidence I was about to collect, and by the time they finally understood what Harold had already put in place, it would already be too late to stop. 2 days after my visit to Daniel's office, my children began behaving in a way that felt strangely coordinated, as if they had quietly agreed on a plan while I wasn't listening. My daughter suddenly insisted on organizing my medications, even though I had managed them perfectly well for years. My son began asking small questions about bills and property taxes, questions that sounded helpful on the surface, but always circled back to the same idea, that things might be difficult for me to handle alone. My youngest watched me closely whenever I spoke, studying my face as though she were waiting for a mistake. To anyone looking in from the outside, it might have appeared that 3 devoted children were simply trying to help their grieving mother. But once you have stood outside your own kitchen window and listened to your children calmly planning how to control your life, it becomes impossible to mistake strategy for kindness. Every conversation now carried a faint edge of calculation. Every smile felt slightly rehearsed. That evening, my son suggested we all sit down together at the kitchen table. The overhead light cast a soft yellow circle across the wood where Harold and I had shared thousands of quiet meals over the years. My daughter placed a cup of tea in front of me and folded her hands together carefully. "Mom," she began gently, "we've been talking about what's best for you right now." Those words made my chest tighten. Whenever someone says what's best for you, it usually means they have already decided what is best for themselves. My eldest son cleared his throat and slid a small stack of papers across the table. "You've been through a lot," he said calmly. "Losing Dad so suddenly can affect judgment. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly." I looked down at the papers without touching them. I already knew what they were. The recording on my phone had prepared me for this moment. "It's only temporary," my daughter added quickly. "Just until things settle down." Guardianship papers. My children wanted legal control of my life. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly the way they expected them to. Then I slowly placed both palms on the table and looked at each of them in turn. My son pushed the papers a little closer. "You don't even have to read everything right now," he said reassuringly. "Just sign where it's marked." For 72 years, I had tried to keep peace in my family, smoothing arguments and forgiving careless words, because I believed patience would eventually be returned with love. But sitting there in that kitchen, watching my own children calmly attempt to take control of my life, I finally understood something painful and simple. They weren't asking for help. They were asking for surrender. I pushed the papers slowly back across the table. "No," I said quietly. The room fell completely silent. My daughter blinked in surprise. My youngest leaned back in her chair. My son stared at me as though he had just heard something impossible. "Mom," he said slowly, "you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied gently. "And I'm not signing anything." Confusion flickered across their faces. Their plan had assumed grief would make me weak. What they couldn't see was that while they were trying to prove I wasn't capable of managing my life, when the guardianship papers failed, my children changed tactics. Instead of pushing me openly, they began creating small situations designed to make me appear forgetful. My daughter would ask the same question twice and exchange a quick glance with my son if my answer changed even slightly. My youngest began leaving small objects around the house and then asking if I remembered where they belonged. At first, the pattern was subtle, but once I noticed it, the intention became painfully obvious. They were gathering moments, little fragments of behavior they could later present as evidence that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. Harold used to call that planting seeds. Fortunately for me, seeds can grow in more than one direction. Every time they tried one of these quiet tests, my phone was nearby. Sometimes it rested on the kitchen counter. Sometimes it sat on the coffee table. Each time, the small recording light captured their carefully guided questions and the way they tried to twist ordinary moments into something suspicious. A few days later, my son revealed the next step in their plan. "We scheduled a small appointment," he said casually while glancing at his watch. "Just a routine cognitive evaluation." My daughter quickly added that it was perfectly normal after a loss like mine. In other words, they wanted a doctor to declare that I wasn't capable of managing my own life. I looked at them quietly and nodded. "Of course," I said softly. The surprise on their faces lasted only a moment before relief replaced it. They had expected resistance. My cooperation convinced them their plan was working. 2 days later, we sat together in a quiet medical waiting room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old magazines. A television murmured softly in the corner, while a handful of patients flipped through newspapers. My children sat beside me, rehearsing their expressions of concern. When the nurse finally called my name, I stood and followed her down the hallway. My children tried to come with me, but the nurse politely explained that the evaluation would be conducted privately. Inside the office, the doctor asked questions for nearly 40 minutes. Dates, numbers, memory tests, small decisions about everyday situations. I answered each one calmly, just as Harold had taught me to approach difficult conversations. When the questions finally ended, the doctor looked down at his notes. For several long seconds, he said nothing. The silence stretched across the room like a held breath. Then he leaned back in his chair and smiled gently. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "your memory and judgment appear perfectly normal." When we stepped back into the waiting room, my children stood immediately. My son looked at the doctor with quiet expectation. "Well," he asked. The doctor adjusted his glasses. "Your mother is perfectly capable of managing her own affairs." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. But what my children still didn't understand was that this quiet battle was only beginning. And the evidence, after the doctor's evaluation failed, something inside my children began to change. The patience they had shown during the first days after Harold's death slowly disappeared, replaced by irritation that flickered across their faces whenever they thought I wasn't watching. My son started making more phone calls behind closed doors. My daughter spent long hours typing on her laptop, and closing it quickly when I walked into the room. They had invested too much time in their plan to walk away from it now, but neither had I. Over the next several days, I continued quietly recording every conversation that drifted toward money, control, or my supposed inability to manage my life. Then, one evening, something happened that nearly ended the entire effort. I was sitting in the living room, listening to one of the recordings through my headphones, when my youngest daughter suddenly appeared in the doorway. "What are you listening to?" she asked sharply. For a moment, my heart froze. If she took the phone and opened the recording file, everything would be exposed too soon. I removed the headphones slowly and smiled faintly. "Just an old voicemail from Harold," I said softly. "I like hearing his voice sometimes." Her expression softened immediately. "Oh," she murmured, stepping back into the hallway. The moment she disappeared around the corner, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. The next morning, I drove to Daniel Brooks's office once again and placed my phone on his desk. "You should hear this," I said quietly. As the recordings played, my children's voices filled the room describing their strategy, their plans for guardianship, and their growing frustration that I refused to cooperate. When the final recording ended, Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his hands thoughtfully. "Margaret," he said slowly, "your children believe they're building a legal case against you." I nodded. "But they're actually building one against themselves." A small smile appeared on his face. "Yes," he said, "exactly." Then he opened a drawer in his desk and removed a folder I had never seen before. Inside were several documents already prepared and waiting. Daniel looked at me carefully before speaking again. "If you're ready," he said quietly, "we can begin the process of presenting this evidence to a judge." For a moment, I simply stared at the papers. My children believed they were slowly tightening control around a grieving widow who didn't understand what was happening. What they didn't realize was that the case they were building against me had already begun moving quietly toward a courtroom. For several nights after my meeting with Daniel, I slept very little. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had finally shifted from grief to clarity. For weeks, my children had believed they were slowly building a case against a confused old woman who no longer understood the world around her. What they didn't realize was that the quiet recordings on my phone, the emails Harold had preserved, and the documents Daniel now held in his office had already begun forming a very different story, one that a judge would soon hear for himself. Daniel explained that the next step needed to be handled carefully. If we moved too quickly, my children might try to change their story or destroy evidence. But if we waited too long, they might attempt another legal tactic to gain control. So we chose a middle path, something quiet but decisive. Daniel would file a formal response to any guardianship attempt, and at the same time, he would submit the recordings and documentation, showing exactly what my children had been planning behind closed doors. 3 days later, my eldest son announced that he had scheduled another meeting at the house to talk about important family decisions. His tone carried a confidence that suggested he believed the situation was still under his control. I agreed calmly, just as I had agreed to everything else. And that evening, my children gathered again around the kitchen table, where so many of their plans had begun. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, as if even the walls sensed that something was about to change. My son began speaking almost immediately, explaining that we needed to revisit the guardianship idea because it would simplify things for everyone. My daughter nodded in agreement, and my youngest leaned back in her chair, watching my reaction closely. This time, I didn't pretend confusion. I listened quietly until my son finished. Then I reached into my purse and placed my phone on the table between us. The small movement made them pause. My daughter frowned slightly, as if she sensed something unexpected. I think, I said gently, there are a few things we should listen to together. Before they could ask what I meant, I pressed play. The room filled with the sound of their own voices. The conversation I had recorded the night I stood outside the kitchen window. My son talking about filing for guardianship, my daughter discussing how quickly we needed to act before I spoke to the lawyer, my youngest laughing softly and saying I would sign whatever they gave me. No one moved. The color slowly drained from my son's face as the recording continued. When it ended, the silence in the kitchen was so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the refrigerator. That conversation, I said quietly, has already been submitted to my lawyer. My daughter's voice came out tight. You recorded us. Yes, I answered calmly. And not just that one. Their expressions shifted from shock to something much darker. The realization that their careful plan had been observed from the very beginning. But what they still didn't understand was that this moment, shocking as it felt to them, was only the beginning of what was about to happen, because while they were sitting there trying to figure out how much I knew, Daniel was already preparing the evidence. 2 weeks later, we sat in a quiet courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and polished floors. My children arrived first, whispering urgently to one another, while their lawyer reviewed documents beside them. I could see the tension in their faces now, the confident expressions they once carried replaced by something closer to worry. They still believed, however, that the situation could somehow be explained away. After all, they had spent weeks convincing themselves they were only trying to help their grieving mother. When Daniel and I entered the room, the conversation on their side of the courtroom stopped immediately. My son stared at me as if trying to read something in my expression that might reveal how much damage had already been done. But I simply sat quietly beside Daniel and folded my hands in my lap. For the first time since Harold died, I felt completely steady. The hearing began with my children's lawyer, presenting their concern that I might no longer be capable of managing my own affairs. He spoke politely, carefully, emphasizing how worried my children were about my well-being after the emotional shock of losing my husband to someone who didn't know the full story. It might have sounded sincere. Then Daniel stood up. He spoke calmly, beginning not with accusations, but with facts. He explained Harold's trust, the legal protections already in place, and the cognitive evaluation that had confirmed I was fully capable of managing my life. Then he placed a small device on the evidence table. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe the court should hear a conversation recorded in Mrs. Collins's own home." The recording filled the courtroom, clear and unmistakable. My children's voices echoed against the walls as they discussed guardianship, money, and the assumption that grief had made me weak. I watched their faces while the audio played. At first they looked stunned, then pale, and finally deeply afraid as they understood that the judge was hearing every word. When the recording ended, Daniel quietly presented the emails Harold had saved, the documentation of repeated financial requests, and the additional recordings where my children tried to create evidence that I was confused. Each piece of evidence fit together like a puzzle that revealed a picture no one could deny. The judge listened carefully to everything before speaking. His voice was calm but firm. He explained that the court found no evidence that I was incapable of managing my affairs. On the contrary, the evidence suggested something very different: an organized attempt to manipulate and control an elderly parent for financial gain. My children sat frozen as those words settled over the courtroom. But the judge wasn't finished yet. The courtroom was completely silent when the judge finished reviewing the final documents. My children sat rigidly beside their lawyer, their earlier confidence now replaced by a stunned disbelief that seemed to drain all the color from their faces. For weeks, they had believed they were quietly constructing a legal path toward control of my life and Harold's estate. What they hadn't considered was that every step of that plan had been leaving a trail, a clear record of intentions that no court could ignore. The judge leaned forward slightly and spoke in a tone that carried both authority and disappointment. He explained that the guardianship petition was being dismissed immediately, and that the evidence presented raised serious concerns about attempted financial exploitation. He also reminded my children that the legal trust Harold had established placed the estate completely beyond their reach unless I chose otherwise. In other words, the fortune they had been quietly planning to control was never actually theirs to claim. For a long moment, none of them said a word. My son stared down at the table. My daughter's eyes filled with quiet shock, and my youngest looked as though she had suddenly realized that the entire story they had built in their minds had collapsed. The judge finished by warning them that any further attempts to interfere with my financial independence could lead to serious legal consequences. When the hearing ended, Daniel gathered the documents calmly and placed a reassuring hand on my arm. As we walked out of the courtroom, I felt something I hadn't felt since Harold's death, a quiet sense of peace, not because my children had been humiliated, and not because they had lost access to the fortune they once believed would be theirs, but because the truth had finally been spoken out loud where no one could twist it anymore. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt warm on my face. Daniel asked if I was all right, and I told him something that had been slowly forming in my mind since the beginning of this painful experience. Harold had spent years preparing for the possibility that greed might one day divide our family, and because of his foresight, the life we built together was still protected. But the greatest lesson of all was something much simpler. Family is not defined by who expects to inherit what you own. Family is defined by who stands beside you when you have nothing to offer but love. My children eventually left town, their anger and embarrassment carrying them far away from the quiet life Harold and I had built. I don't know if they will ever fully understand what happened or why their plan failed so completely, but every evening when I sit on the old porch swing Harold made with his own hands, listening to the soft creak of the chains in the evening breeze, I remember the promise he once made me during a quiet conversation many years ago. No matter what happens, he had said, you will never face this world unprotected. And in the end, he was right. If this story meant something to you, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to Silent Tale Studio.